This podcast was created to educate listeners on the experiences of diverse individuals. However, all opinions expressed by the host or guests do not reflect the overall standing of Tarleton Radio or Tarleton State University.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Making Space, a Diversity Dialogue. I'm your host, Cole, and this is a bi-weekly podcast where together we'll have questions answered about socially sensitive topics while learning how to create lasting relationships with diverse people. If you haven't already, I definitely recommend going back and listening to the first part in this series all about Native Americans and Indigenous peoples. This episode, we've got another Tarleton student joining me, who has also worked with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion and International Programs, Kaylee, Sixkiller. And she brings a little bit of a different perspective as she was adopted into the Cherokee heritage and culture. Will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a senior here at Tarleton. I'm a history major with also working with education, so I want to be a high school history teacher.
Okay.
So when I was 5, my mom remarried, and she happened to remarry a Cherokee man.
Okay.
I didn't have a relationship with my biological dad, and so when she remarried, I think even before they got married, I asked him if I could call him dad, and he was 100% my dad, and he has been my dad my entire life, and so when I was in my early teens, I asked him to adopt me. And, we went through the legal process of changing my name, but adoption's expensive. And
it really is. It really is.
It really only counts good before you turn 18 as like, okay, this is your legal parent. And they've...
Right. And that doesn't mean they're not your parent anymore. Exactly. Yeah. And that... something in the eyes of the government. They're just like, okay, you don't need parents anymore when you're 18. Well, that's not true.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd spent up until that point, because my biological dad lost parental rights when I was 3, so I just didn't have a legal father most of my life, and so I was just used to that as my experience. And but I usually explain it to people if I really get into it. The irony there is that usually when I'm around my dad, a lot of the time people will say like, oh yeah, you look Native American, or you two look alike. And I'm like, that's fascinating that you're able to see what genetics didn't do.
Right. I will say people have a way of sticking their foot in their mouth that way.
Yeah. But usually it's just funny. But I just explain it as, I'm adopted by my stepdad, and he's Cherokee, and so he's passed down that culture to me. And
would you say that you feel like you are definitely aware and definitely a part of that culture and heritage? And how do you go about that being adopted?
So as a kid, there was a little bit of, because I went by the last name Sixkiller, which is very obviously not white.
Yes, for sure.
And later on, I can tell the story behind that last name too. But I went by Sixkiller before it was legally my last name. And so there was sometimes comments made by people when, my biological dad's name would come out, and they'd be like, oh, you lied. And I'm like, no, you're just stupid. It was always the idiot boy in the back of the room in class. So.
The one who has a but for sure. That doesn't quite understand the rules yet.
There's more nuance to life than that. But so it was just, my grandparents live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, so they're in the nation. They have the license plate and everything, which people don't think about at all. But, like, if you go up to Oklahoma, you can always tell what tribe someone's part of because they'll have the license plate from that tribe. So you don't just you don't just see Oklahoma. You'll see Choctaw and Cherokee. And we lived in the Chickasaw Nation when I was little. And even within the northeastern Oklahoma, you'll see Cherokee Nation, which is what my family's a member, citizens of. But you also have the United Kiowa Band of Cherokee Indians, and then out back east, you have the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. Okay. So there's 3 tribes.
So now you mentioned kind of nations, and this is something we went over a little bit in the last episode. But can you kind of explain again the difference between nation and is it like a reservation or are they separate? Are they something that's used interchangeably? The last episode, we kind of had a different perspective where they were separate, complete entities, and I didn't know what was kind of the Cherokee end of that. If that's
Yeah, no. So we
right.
kind of view it as like we're all Cherokees, we're all part of that tribe, but then we have our specific nations within that. The nation is more of a like political entity than a actual
allotment of land.
Okay. Definitely not a reservation. That's a point of contention, actually. Because, you know, we're like, we don't live in reservations. We live in a nation and we can choose to leave if we want. And plenty of us do. And there's actually quite a bit of political drama between at-large citizens. So people who live outside of the nation and those who live in. But, but there is this kind of view, at least among the Cherokees that I've interacted with.
Of course, yes. No, it definitely speak to what you feel you can speak to.
Is like there's kind of this unspoken we're better because we live in Oklahoma and we live in nations. We don't live on reservations. We're not those Native Americans.
So there's some sort of like a little bit of class tension there.
Absolutely. Because the Trail of Tears or the removal, as we tend to call it, happened in the 1830s.
Yeah.
And you know, we're shoved into Oklahoma and no one wants to live there for a very long time, and that's great. I personally don't want to live in Oklahoma right now. So, you know, it's
yeah, I mean, you're in Texas right now.
Yeah. So. But we kind of watched what was happening with the Indian Wars in the 1870s as like that's not us, even though nowadays Native Americans are always grouped together.
That does seem to be the case, even though there's, I don't have the number on it, but it's in many hundreds of different
federally recognized tribes. Yeah.
Yes.
And it's we definitely kind of have this like, oh well, we're not those that like fought everyone. We just kind of, you know, we moved and we try to make the best of it and have been very successful, I think, you know, as far as. But the nation exists. We have our tribal council. We have our current chief is Chief Hoskins.
Okay.
My personal favorite was Wilma Mankiller, who was our first female chief. That was the, I think, 80s or 90s was when she was.
Okay.
But she was really big into AIMS, the American Indian Movement. I know the Occupy Alcatraz thing that happened in the 60s. She was big into that, and she was really good for the nation, I think. But.
If this doesn't seem too insensitive, I really have no idea about this sort of thing. Are your particular nation's chiefs elected, or are they chosen by the council? Or?
Yeah, so our tribal council, it's very much similar to the American government. So we have our constitution. I cannot for the life of me remember how many are on the tribal council. There's a certain, so for each of the districts within the nation, there's an elected representative.
Okay.
And that's a tribal council member. And then 3 or 4 maybe for at-large citizens are elected. And so the citizens that don't live within the nation. So like my family lives in Texas, so we're at large. And for a while, and this is funny, just the way the boundaries are drawn, my grandparents lived in another part of Tulsa, and they were actually at-large citizens.
Oh, just because they were slightly outside.
They were slightly outside,
All
yeah.
Right.
Because Tulsa's split between the Creek Nation, the Muskogee Creek Nation, and the Cherokee. And so then there's a few, you know, so the tribal councils are elected representatives, and then we vote on the chief and assistant chief. I know there's 2 of them.
Okay.
But our current is Chief Hoskins. I think he's better than our last one, but
okay, all right.
You know, but there's it's a whole big to-do in the Cherokee Phoenix, which is our newspaper that no matter where you are in the world, they will send you a copy of the Cherokee Phoenix.
That's really amazing.
And that gives you all of what's going on in Tahlequah, which is our capital, and within the nation that gives you a rundown of all of the candidates. When it's election season, it gives you the rundown of all the candidates and everything. And then they also have quite a few articles that will be just written in Cherokee for Cherokee speakers.
Wow, that's cool. Is that something? This is purely my curiosity. I'm sorry, but is election season the same as the United States?
So my family is never in the nation when elections are going on.
Okay. And you have to be in the nation to...
No, my dad can vote via mail-in, basically. Which is like
no mail-in ballots.
I kind of brought that up and I was like, it's just what we do for the chief. And my dad's like, yeah, but that's not as important.
Yeah, okay.
Because the chief is important for us Cherokees, but... and we have our own police force and we have our own government and they make housing, there's housing and we have hospitals and then obviously the casinos that are all kind of managed by the nation. But it's really kind of, you kind of have to treat it almost like a really big local government rather than how we think of like
the
America.
United States as a nation, right? Okay.
Because we still have to follow the laws of the United States, and we still have to.
Do you know if your chief works closely with, like, the United States higher government, or?
So we do, and this is I could be totally wrong about who our representative is.
I know you're not like a political person. I'm sorry. I'm just
it's
curious.
Okay. It's okay. We do have a representative to the U.S. government. I do believe that that's a kind of like an ambassadorship, and it's just it's given. I don't believe she's elected.
Chosen by the chief, perhaps.
Yeah, or the tribal council. I cannot remember her first name, but I know she's from the Teehee family, which I've always found so interesting that they didn't translate their name, because that's just killer. There's like the rest of it, like all the rest of us translated our name, but I guess y'all didn't decide to. So.
Okay, and how are you able to participate in certain things like that? I know maybe you can't participate in the government aspect, but I don't know, maybe can you be adopted?
I tell my dad who to vote for, so I'm the one who pays attention. I tell my dad who to vote for, and then he tells his parents, so that's kind of that. But so we have our national holiday every Labor Day weekend, and that's in Tahlequah, and it's, if you think about maybe kind of your stereotypes behind, like a powwow is kind of part of it, but that's where we have like our State of the Nation address that our chief gives, a whole ton of speeches. The Cherokee National Youth Choir will sing.
Oh, wow.
Big stickball tournament, which is kind of like lacrosse. That's our big sport.
Equivalent. Okay. All right.
So it's just kind of like a weekend of all of the Cherokees all over come together who are in the nation, who descend upon Tahlequah and take part.
That's really cool. That is really cool.
So that's part of it. I participate on Facebook and I try to learn language. Cherokee Nation is really doing a huge push right now to revitalize the language. So
that is interesting, because I have a personal friend who is Indigenous, and they are definitely very secretive with their language, because it's very important to them, and
we're not like that at all.
They feel as if like they maybe won't even, if they ever have children, they maybe won't even like teach them that language, because but that's interesting. That I like to hear what other Indigenous and Native American folks feel about their language. And
yeah, we're very, very proud of our written language, which is created by Sequoia. And we're the only tribe that has their own alphabet, and it's a syllabary. But so we're very proud of our language, written language. It's incredibly hard to learn, having been trying for the last few years.
Yeah. Is that something you would share with people who are not Cherokee?
Yeah, for sure. My brother went away to summer camp, and I had some fabric markers, and he had a white pillowcase.
Oh.
And he was like, "Can you write my name on here so like no one steals my pillow?" And so I wrote his name in Cherokee on there.
Okay.
And, you know, I put how to say it down at the bottom. So if anyone asks, you know, I didn't just put the Cherokee letters and be like, all right, have fun, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, no, we're very big. If you go into the nation, all of our street signs have the language on them.
Okay.
Handicap signs will have the language on them. Like all of the buildings that are government related have it. So there's a huge you know, we're a bilingual nation, and we're trying to make that the way.
Okay. That's really cool.
So yeah.
Going back to what you even said about Labor Day weekend, and you're going to have your celebration, do you ever have any issues or conflicts between your culture or heritage and being at Tarleton, which is a predominantly European and white school?
My biggest challenge is Tulsa's just really far away for a drive.
Oh, yeah.
And it's always hot that weekend. And then, you know, COVID has been a thing. So, like, our national holiday was online this year, which is really kind of weird. But, no, I'm so used to, because even when I lived in Oklahoma, we lived in the Chickasaw Nation. So I wasn't even within, but definitely up there, no one batted an eye that my last name was Sixkiller.
Okay.
And so that was my first 4 years that I was using that last name. I was amongst people who like, okay, whatever. That's whatever.
Normal.
That's normal.
Okay.
We don't care. Yeah, everyone's Indian here. It was kind of the sentiment in Oklahoma.
All right.
And then I'm moving to Texas was, you know, even though I was born here and I lived here for 5 years before I moved to Oklahoma, I came back to Texas with this like almost new identity. Mm-hmm. You know, through your this father. Added family, mm-hmm. you know, and it was definitely weird because all of a sudden people did care about my last name. And, you know, most of the time it's always, that's so cool, or, oh, did you kill 6 people? And all of that. And I really I don't get anything from Tarleton per se, but I did have Kahoot censor my last name.
Really?
Yeah.
Because it said killer in it?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And when I emailed him about it, they were like, just use a different name. And I was like, number one, my professor's telling me to use my first and last name. Mm-hmm. And number two, I'm assuming you're white and you're telling a Native American person to change their name. There's a lot of history to that statement.
Yeah, that's just really rough right there.
So,
no, that you should definitely be a little bit more accepting and accessible in that instance.
I will say that I had a similar situation with Quizlet trying to censor my name. And when I explained it, they completely were like, oh my gosh, of course, that's your last name. We'll just change that for you. Don't worry. You're approved. So 2 different companies, Kahoot continued, and like I still can't use my last name on Kahoot, whereas Quizlet was like, yeah, sure, that's good. You're good to go.
Okay. Yeah, definitely different perspectives on that for sure. This is something I wanted to get into, especially because it seems as if Cherokee is very popularized, especially in the media. And, of course, like when you think about old TV shows and movies and such, how would you kind of describe Indigenous people and Native Americans' relationship with the media?
You know, it's always funny because even though I'm, you know, Native American, my brother's Native American, and he looks very, you know, and so do my grandparents. They never saw themselves on TV. That was never, you know, we don't wear headdresses.
Something that was talked about last time too.
Yeah, our traditional clothing is looks more like, at least for women, it looks more like a prairie dress. I know it's called a tier or tear depending on who you're talking to dress.
Okay.
But it looks more like something out of Little House on the Prairie, but like what the Ingalls would have worn, not what some tribe would have worn.
Right.
We look different, but we don't look very native as far as traditional dress goes. And, you know, we were never the headdresses and all of that type of thing. So it's, you know, when I see them on the media, it's like, oh yeah, that's another tribe. I don't even like think about it as representing me because it's just so far removed from the reality of most of the Oklahoma tribes that it's just, that's the Plains Indians.
All right. So, in your family, whether looking at the media or not, do you feel like there's a conflict between like what you're seeing as representative of you or representative of Native Americans and Indigenous people as a whole, as being like, is it negative? Do y'all talk about it? Or is it just, no, we just kind of push it away?
One of the interesting things, and again, I don't know the science behind this at all, is that natives are always portrayed as being drunks and like super prone to alcoholism.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I definitely have seen that kind of stuff.
And a side effect of that is my dad won't touch hard liquor.
Really?
He'll drink beer like any of them, but he and his friends may or may not have wiped out the local bar that they go to with beer a couple of Thanksgivings ago. But he won't touch hard liquor because he's got that idea of Native Americans are, and I don't know the science behind it, so I can't say whether he's right or not. But I would say there's this kind of idea that certainly nowadays, especially within like the more, liberal and like woke,
right.
We're all living in trailers on reservations and we're, dirt poor and, we're all drunks and we're never going to get off the res and it's us awful. And I mean, my dad's got a master's degree and he's, they live in a nice house in Tulsa and we live in a nice house up in the DFW area. Like that's just not the reality. And it's not even the reality for most in Oklahoma. I mean, it's, obviously there's poor everywhere. And I think that, being forced to live in one place had some effect, but certainly within my family, they just became farmers because that's what they were doing back in Georgia. And so they become farmers here and just lived their lives and, but the Sixkiller family is absolutely huge because the first Sixkiller, who's just the Sixkiller, had something like 9 sons.
Wow.
And they all had a bunch of sons. So like I go up to the nation and I will run into another Sixkiller. And it could take 8 generations to find our common ancestor. That's how it happens. So,
wow, that is really cool. Is there anything you wish people would stop doing in relation to Indigenous folks, Native Americans, or specifically the Cherokee?
I think something that I've certainly being in college has brought up, and it's one of those annoyances, is I get you get free college. And then there's a lesser, like, I didn't even realize this was a stereotype until I started, like, interacting with other Native Americans.
Okay.
Is that, like, we don't pay taxes.
Oh, okay.
And I didn't realize that, like, people thought that, because I'm just like, we pay a lot of taxes. I don't know what you're saying. But certainly I don't get free college. When my dad was going to school at OSU, they offered to pay for his tutoring, and that was as much as the nation would help him out.
I see.
With school. My stepbrother didn't get anything from the nation when he was going to school. My little brother probably won't get anything.
Yeah.
So there's this idea that like, because there's almost this idea that, you get free college because that's reparations. And I'm like, I mean, I don't think reparations should happen, period. Because I'm like, the current government didn't do it. Now with the current government's done some,
yeah, to a lot of different people, for sure.
To a lot of different people. But
yes.
I think most Cherokee certainly would agree that kind of we just want to live our lives and be successful and be allowed to flourish. And yes, that was the past, but that's not how it is now. And we just want to, let us rebuild from that. And look how amazing we are despite all that, but that's not everything about us. And we certainly don't get free college, whether from the government or the nation. Yeah.
Would you say that your nation's belief that maybe the past is in the past is something that's completely different than other nations, or is it the same? Or I
definitely think that's part of the tension we have with some of the other tribes. And I think that's kind of, I mentioned before, Oklahoma's very Republican. And that extends to the tribes as well. And I think they're kind of part of that mentality of, yes, bad things happen. It's in the past. We're moving on. Whereas a lot of the tribes in the plains who frankly have had it worse, part of the removal was that we got removed and then we were left alone for a very long time until the land runs in the late 1880s. And whereas the Plains Indians, I mean, they were more systematically wiped out than we were.
I see.
They have a lot more anger, and I think they have a lot more justified anger towards the government than we do. And that means that we're able to say it's in the past, whereas I think a lot of the Plains tribes or just all of the I'm kind of gesturing to this part of the United States. I think they were hurt a lot more.
They're still dealing with a lot of trauma.
Still dealing with it. And I think of like the First Nations in Canada, and it's still happening, like it's still awful up there. And it's just like, that's just.
Yeah, you think of Canada, a lot of times I think people think of Canada as being this best place. And
as a Native person, I do not.
Yeah. For certain people, I will say for certain people, especially in the LGBTQ plus community, it's a really good place. But not, I suppose, if you're Indigenous.
Yeah. So I think that's, part of it is just our history is so different in relation to the U.S. government, and it's farther back too. There's people still alive who remember the residential schools, whereas for us, we don't have that experience. So, and I think there's a lot of assumptions that we're just this monolithic one Indigenous Native identity group, and we're not. Yeah, we're very, very different. And even within Oklahoma, there's certainly, oh well, of course they're Choctaw. Of course they said that. There's still some kind of, especially for us, because we were all fighting back east, and then we're shoved into this really small piece of land.
Yeah.
I mean, my last name comes from a battle that happened against Muskogee Creeks. So
wow,
and obviously we don't hold any bad feelings, but they're a different tribe than us.
Okay.
And they're different,
Yeah. Is that something you feel like and your family feels pretty strongly about? Like, are you always sure to make that distinction that we, so to speak, we are Cherokee, we are not this other tribe?
I don't think it's so much of a we're not them. It's more of, and I've said this a few times, it's like, yes, I say I'm Native American and that's the identity, but if we really want to get into I'm Cherokee, and I think most people would agree that it's, yes, we're Native American if you want to group us all together, but we're also our individual tribes that have their own histories and our own language and our own leaders and our own, and a lot of times religion, even though by and large most Cherokee are Baptist.
Okay, yeah.
I laugh.
With assimilation, that makes sense.
I worked one of my jobs. I'm not going to say which one. Not one here in Stephenville. I had a boss who we were talking about Christmas plans, and I was like, "Oh yeah, I've got this church service with my family, and then I have this church service later." And he just looks at me and he goes, "Church?" And I was like, "Yeah, like we live in Texas, bro. Like what?"
Yeah,
it's Christmas. And he was like, "I thought your family do rain dances or something." And
dear,
I was just like,
that's extremely offensive. Wow,
I was so shocked. I was like, "No, my Cherokee family's Baptist." So,
wow,
no,
yeah. So never assume anything. And even if you do assume, definitely take correction. I'm telling the listeners right now, but with so many things we've learned about, that is definitely one that is always there.
And I think even we as natives have assumptions about other natives. Like I talked about, like we definitely have those are the other tribes kind of. And, I think humans in general are prone to assuming things.
Yes, that's true. And I feel like there's definitely an aspect of humans we can see in these episodes that I've already put out, but also just in this. People like to be outside people like to group majorities together or even minorities together. And then there are those like us and them tendencies that we all have, I think.
For sure, yeah.
All right, let's I want to get into this a little bit. And can you describe, because you've used a few different terms, and I asked this to our previous guest for part 1, but what would you say the difference is between using Native American versus Indigenous, and what do you think people should be using if they're not Native American or Indigenous?
I think always kind of, with me, it's there's this double-edged sword here. I say my last name and automatically I'm no longer white, no matter what my, the reality is. I'm no longer white in people's eyes. And so that means that I don't get to ever avoid being Native American.
Right.
And it leads to, people, say my last name. I'm like, yeah, I'm Sixkiller. And then they're like, oh, that's an interesting, a lot of times adults, what they'll say, because I work with high school and middle schoolers.
Right.
They will say anything, but adults will say, oh, that's a really interesting last name. And I'm like, yeah, I'm Native American. And so that leads me to be able to say to that person, here's what I prefer to be called.
Okay.
With other natives, I tend to err on the side of caution and always use Indigenous until they use another term. Because I know that currently Indigenous is the most accepted, especially amongst those who are very active in seeking social justice for Native Americans.
Okay. Yeah,
I know
that makes sense for sure.
They really prefer the term Indigenous. I've just always used Native American growing up. I mean, we even used Indian a lot of the time.
Okay.
In my household. So, but I know, where I went to high school, we had a large, actually Indian community.
All right.
And they're the ones who tend to take offense at us being called Indian. And so, out of respect for everyone, I either use Native American or Indigenous. But it's really up to the individual person what they prefer and what they think.
All right. So maybe at least until you know for sure what that person uses, you use Indigenous.
Yeah, and I think, to anyone listening, if you're meeting someone who's Native American, ask them their tribe.
Okay.
And that will... because if someone said, oh, I say I'm Native American, I'm like, oh, what tribe? And that gives me the opportunity to say, I'm Cherokee. And I'm from this specific group. I'm not just part of this monolithic minority that exists. So if you meet someone, ask them their tribe and refer to them by that tribe, because I think that, which shows you care a lot more, because obviously you're paying attention to details, but
you're no longer lumped into this huge, almost cloud of of unseen individuals.
Exactly.
For sure. Okay, I want to get into this as well. We talked a little bit about it last time again, but could you explain to you what the idea of blood quantum is and what your thoughts on the idea of blood quantum?
So as a Cherokee, I'm very against blood quantum.
Okay.
Fairly positive, could get fact check on this, but it's in our Constitution that we don't hold to blood quantum. So if you're Cherokee, you're Cherokee. Does not matter if it's 1/1,000,000th of a drop of blood, or if you're full blood, which there are a few that still are alive. They're very, very old. There aren't many full bloods still, and there is, you do still run into sometimes that, oh, well, I'm full blooded, or they'll be described as full blooded, but for the most part, we all are mixed. And so we all deal with whatever that means. And it's blood quantum was always, I know some tribes, it was kind of a way for the government to track, how much they are. And for us, we're like, no, you're part of us. You're part of us. Does not matter how much that is. And so,
is that something that still people are having to prove to the nation, the Cherokee Nation?
So we don't prove it by blood or anything. So how you become a citizen of the nation, like if you think that if your family's always said, oh, we have Cherokee, find someone who's good at genealogy, or if you're good at genealogy, do it yourself. You can track your family history, and then you find a couple of those last names, and you will go look at the Dawes rolls, which
yes,
were the census rolls for us. And if you can prove that you have family on the Dawes rolls, you're a citizen.
Okay. Interesting.
And that's as simple as that. And so there's no blood or anything. It's just, here's my family tree. Here's this person that's on the Dawes roll. And there's an application process, but that's basically it.
Okay. Interesting. And when I was reading, this is something to bring up for sure, listeners who probably don't even know where blood quantum began, but I will include a link, just like I did last time, into a very informative article, newsletter, that blood quantum actually started in the slave trade, and of course by white people. Just to say, okay, this person is this much this, so they are Native American. And so they are sold as Native American.
I might get some flack for this, but since you bring up the slave trade, Cherokees owned slaves.
Oh, really? Mm-hmm. They owned or own?
They owned.
Okay.
And a lot of Cherokees, and it actually, the Civil War split the nation, and it still kind of splits the nation. No one would admit that. And being in my family, we had most of my Cherokee family fought for the Union. Ironically, a lot of them also owned slaves. But it was with the Civil War in particular, it was, we're going to promise you who's going to promise you the better deal if they win? I'm going to go fight for the one who offered me a better deal. Mm-hmm. Most of my family thought the Union was offering them a better deal.
Okay.
So they went with that. But for sure, Cherokees, I mean, they assimilated hardcore into white culture.
Yeah.
And that was, whether it was marrying into white families, whether it was sending their kids to white schools, whether it was dressing more European, whether it was owning slaves and having plantations like everyone else in Georgia was doing if you're successful at that point. And it's a couple of years ago, it was a huge point of contention among Cherokees because, as it goes with slave owners, you know that the owner and the enslaved probably share some blood.
Yes, for sure.
And
so there's still family kind of lineage there.
Well, there's the Cherokee freedmen, and they were fighting for citizenship, and a lot of Cherokees are like, you're not Cherokee. And they're like, we definitely are, but because the nature of it is that to accept the freedmen, who aren't even freedmen now, but that's kind of what they're referred to as, you have to admit that your family was involved in rape and enslaving people, and so it's a super sensitive topic. So I might get other Cherokees might not appreciate me talking about that because it's definitely not talked about.
Right. I mean, I can't say that it's not hidden from a lot of different families, but that is interesting. I hadn't even thought about that. Is that in assimilating and being, well, honestly, trying to protect yourselves and trying to live as long and as prosperous as you can, you may end up having that.
I mean, there was a huge, if you listen to kind of stuff that they were saying at the time of the removal, there was this huge fight for, we need to preserve our culture, but we also need to be respected by these white people who now are in our land. And
right.
For a very long time, they thought that's through assimilation, and then the removal happened, and they kind of pushed back against that a little bit. Well, clearly assimilation didn't work. But they still had picked up all these bad habits, as awful as it is to refer to slavery like that.
Do you still see, I mean, of course, there's obviously racism in the United States, and I gotta tell people that it's still there. But do you feel like there's a lot of racism also in the nation?
It's Oklahoma. My mom describes Oklahoma as Texas 30 years ago.
Oh, I can't say I've ever been to Oklahoma, so...
I mean, it's if you like nature... That sounds terrible.
Okay.
It's some beautiful nature. And I think if you're interested in Native Americans and you live in Texas, it's a great place to go to learn about history. Every tribe pretty much has a university that they're closely affiliated with. For us, we have Northeastern State, which is in Tahlequah, and you can go and learn so much. We have our Heritage Center, which includes the Dilligwa, which is a village that's set up to look like 1740s, a Cherokee village in 1740. Mm-hmm. And then they also have a village that would have been right after the removal. So you can learn so much. But I would say I think just because you're in a minority doesn't mean that you can't be racist.
Yeah, that is definitely understandable.
And I would say it's, a lot of people kind of assume that there's this empathy there, but
so getting into listeners and maybe their ideas, they want to learn more. Is that okay to go up? So how do they approach going somewhere to learn about the Cherokee Nation, or is it just specifically the Cherokee Nation that's okay with this? Or, I mean, of course you can't speak to other nations, but
obviously come to the casino, spend your money,
support.
Support. That's what funds our hospitals. For Cherokees, we put a lot of our casino money towards housing and on hospitals. But I think our national holiday is open to everyone. So if it's Labor Day weekend and you feel like driving up to Tahlequah, Oklahoma, feel free. I recommend you stay at a hotel in Tulsa and just make the 35 to 45 minute drive to Tahlequah. It's smaller than Stephenville to give you kind of perspective on how small it is.
That's small for all the listeners who aren't in Stephenville for sure.
And it's it's open to everyone, and that's a great way to learn because one, you have all of these Cherokees who are around and who are very active in the culture. You'll be able to hear, I mean, the State of the Nation's kind of boring because he talks a lot about, it's the state of the nation, know.
Right.
But it's, that's a great way. Our Heritage Center is always open, and that is a place where, like I said, that we have the Dilligwa, so you can go around and there's a tour guide who will explain a lot of Cherokee culture to you there. Mm-hmm. And you can, that way, Cherokee Nation website is absolutely fantastic for cultural resources, as well as there's a whole word list. Sorry, I didn't.
You're okay.
Translate in my head.
Yeah, that's fine.
So the word list that's up there that you can type in an English word and they'll give you the Cherokee word for it. Mm-hmm. If you're wanting to, maybe learn. There's a TV show called OCO, which is how we say hello. And it's Voices of the Cherokee People, and you can find it on YouTube, and they have multiple seasons. They've won a few awards, and it's entirely talking about what's happening in the nation, and it talks about Cherokee culture, and
that's really cool.
So there's tons of resources if you're wanting to learn. I know about Cherokee. I don't know so much about the other tribes, mm-hmm. but being one of the bigger, more well-known tribes kind of puts this, I hate to use burden of responsibility, but there's a feel within the nation of people know that we exist and they know that we're here. Let's educate them about us.
Right. We wish it weren't true that certain people have to be the ones to educate others, especially when it's a lot of other people asking these questions. But it's nice that they're able to do that, for sure. I have 2 more questions, and then we can wrap up. But first, I want to ask what you think the biggest issues are whether that be between society and Indigenous folks, or maybe just in the Cherokee Nation. What do you think the biggest issue is today in modern times?
I think Cherokees themselves would say that fighting for our culture and our language is the biggest issue. And just, teaching younger Cherokees, because as well and good, we have the Sequoia schools, which are Cherokee immersion schools in Tahlequah. So from K through 12, you can go and just go to school in Cherokee. That's the language that you're using.
Wow.
And that's great and fantastic for those who live in the nation, but there's so many Cherokee who don't live in the nation. And there is this, we need to bring them in and make sure that everyone's learning the culture and the history. Interacting with other people, I think just the assumptions made about us can be frustrating. I tend to get more frustrated when people just assume that we're all one group. Because, I know you have a question about cultural appropriation on here. And
yes.
a lot of the time it's not my culture that's getting appropriated. It's the Plains. It's another tribe. People don't know enough to appropriate Cherokee culture, as awful as that is.
Yeah.
But I think if you're in the nation, you're not really appropriating, you're learning and you're appreciating.
Right.
One of the interesting things I see sometimes is so fry bread is really popular.
I've definitely heard of it. I've heard of it, yes.
Yeah. It's technically Navajo.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
But there's a amazing restaurant in Tahlequah. If you do decide to go visit Tahlequah, called Del Rancho, and you would think it's a Mexican restaurant. It's not. It's American.
Yeah, it does sound Mexican, doesn't it?
No, but it's an American restaurant. But they serve amazing Indian tacos.
Okay.
That's what they're called. And it's a piece of fry bread with taco fixins on top. And it's fantastic. And that's kind of a weird situation where there's this cultural exchange amongst Native Americans.
Right.
And no one really bats an eye at that. But I think maybe I've seen some people say, well, if you're not Native, you can't eat fry bread. And I'm like, if you can make good fry bread, please tell me how, because I can never successfully get it fluffy enough.
All right.
But, it's, and when you think about legends like Wendigo or skinwalkers, there's definitely, thoughts. And then, we have our own, we get very superstitious here. We have our own stories of fairy-like things.
Right.
We don't talk about them so they don't bother us, but
of course.
But and that's a story that hasn't really expanded outside of the Cherokee Nation. But I know every Cherokee who I mentioned, we have these fairy-like little creatures. About to say their name, and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, no, don't talk about them. Don't talk about them." But then you think Wendigo and skinwalkers, everyone knows about those. And as a Native American I grew up with, they're 100% real. Don't bother them.
Yeah.
So I think it's the cultural sharing is interesting
for sure
to have happen.
Yeah. Okay. So what can listeners do to advocate for Native American people and Indigenous folks? That if they're trying to help understand and also trying to help support you guys?
I think educating yourself is number one, whether that's listening to this, whether that's going to the different nations' websites and reading up on the culture, whether that's maybe not watching documentaries because sometimes they're not entirely accurate.
The documentaries, you got to also think about who is doing the documentary for sure and what's funded and everything. Yeah,
I think if it's coming from a Native voice, you're doing okay. Okay, and just listen to it, listen to them, and just educate yourself. And if you're in a situation where some information, just say the information I don't think there's any issue with that, but and I don't think there's really, I know sometimes there's a huge issue with speaking over the minority voice that's trying to speak. Yes. I haven't seen that much with Native Americans. It could just be that no one's really talking about us.
Yeah, I definitely think as of last year, the social movements have, I don't want to say they've started, because they definitely started a lot earlier than this, but with TikTok and all the online, with all the online popularity of like entertainment and educational entertainment that is spurred from the 2020 COVID-19 quarantine, I think society is trying to figure out what's going on with all the minorities. Like, of course, during 2020, we had George Floyd and a lot of Black Lives Matter movements. And of course, if you haven't listened to those episodes, they're a little ways back in the podcast, but definitely check those out. And then recently, since the time of this recording, we've had the Asian Lives Matter stuff start to happen. That definitely needs to be talked about. And I think hopefully Indigenous folks are getting a little better. I know definitely Columbus Day was talked a lot about. I'm
really proud. Snapchat has Indigenous People Day. They don't have Columbus Day anymore on their
I'm
filters.
So glad about that. For listeners who don't know, Columbus Day is just not a good thing to celebrate. Don't celebrate that. If you want to celebrate something on that day, Indigenous Peoples Day, and do some research, listen to this podcast. And go maybe check out the Cherokee Nation, if you're able to. Yeah, if you're able to drive up to I mean, I think from here it's probably about 6 hours, but I mean that's a regular drive for a Texan. I know, it's like that's not really that far. It's there is a lot of talk. I think Columbus Day is probably the only issue that I know of that outside of actual Native Americans, other people are talking about it because during the Civil Rights Movement, you have AIM, which is the American Indian Movement. And they were relatively big. I mean, they occupied Alcatraz Island. I think they did some things. Yes. But then the 60s died down. And the 60s was a time for movements. And then nothing happened for the next 40 some odd years. And so we're just starting to see, I think, a new generation of Native Americans kind of speaking out about like, hey, we're here. We're still here. I think there's this, I know there's some people who, oh my gosh, I didn't even know Native Americans were still alive. Like, I've had that said to me. And well, listeners, please don't be that person. It's always kind of funny to me because I'm like, we're not just all in a Gene Autry movie, Yeah. It's we do exist, and you need to be heard. We need to be heard, and we're willing to talk. I mean, you go on Facebook, you go on TikTok. I know off the top of my head, Notorious Cree is an actual amazing TikToker. He's from up in Canada, and he does so much amazing stuff with sharing that part of his culture. Obviously, he's a different tribe, but I've seen a lot of. There's been good work done with social media. So many more people have a voice. Yes, for sure. And I mean, right now I gave up TikTok for Lent, so I haven't been on TikTok. Oh no! For gosh, I'm almost done. Almost done. Yeah, you're almost done. I made it. What, like a week? I have a week left. Yeah, a week left. Thank goodness. and for folks who don't know what that is, Lent is just a time when you would give up something. Yeah, so it's the 40 days plus Sundays leading up to Easter. It's Ash Wednesday. It starts on Ash Wednesday, yeah. Yeah, right. Starts on Ash Wednesday. You give up something to kind of feel how Christ would feel. Until, of course, they're reborn. Yeah, and that's always it's always funny to me because people, I think some people assume that when you're in a minority, that's all that you are. And it's like, no, my mom's from a very, very Southern family. I mean, obviously we've been in this country a very long time on my mom's side. But they pretty much got off the boat in Virginia and then they stayed in the South. And so that's a huge part of my identity. And, being Cherokee is part of my identity, but also being Christian and being, I being a historian, I have so many different aspects. And you're an individual. We're individuals. Yes. And I think, especially in the world of activists, that's all you can be is an activist for this one thing. And I certainly wouldn't describe myself as an activist. I just exist. And I like talking about being
Cherokee to people.
Yeah,
so.
no, that's good. I really enjoyed you being on this podcast, and I think the listeners will enjoy the conversation as well. I think I'm gonna end it there. But we went over, of course, a lot of information. There's plenty still out there. Hopefully, I can get Kaylee to send me a link to that website, and I'll put it in the description below for you guys, so you can check it out and do some research and try to get some more questions answered. And if you don't find an answer to a question that you had in this or in the resources I give, don't hesitate to shoot us a message on our social media at The Planet 100.7 on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And just that's where you get updates from the show, and be sure to stay tuned for the next episode and every other week. And until next time, folks, be safe out there and take care.
This has been a Tarleton Radio Network podcast with production from me, Taylor Welch, and me, Carissa Cole. Find more great shows by searching Tarleton Radio Network wherever you get your podcasts.